Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. Dr. Mijal Bitton is a sociologist, storyteller, and Jewish advocate. As the spiritual leader of the Downtown Minyan in Manhattan and one of the first Sachs scholars, she helps young people reclaim and reimagine Jewish traditions. Mijal is no stranger to our AJC audiences. Earlier this month, she delivered a powerful Advocacy Anywhere to commemorate Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, for which the Sachs scholars are, of course, named. And as co-host of Jewish Unpacked's podcast, Wondering Jews, she and Jewish educator Noah Weissman explore questions we all ask about the Jewish experience, from the mundane to the miraculous. In fact, just recently, they interviewed AJC CEO Ted Deutsch. The podcast has covered topics spanning from how summer camp shapes Jewish lives, how to constantly juggle joy and pain, the impact of the Jewish vote in the most recent election, and in turn, the impact of Trump's resulting victory on Jewish America. Mijal is with us now in our Midtown Manhattan studio to rehash a little of that, but also to discuss what led her to take on her many roles, including her newest project. Mijal, welcome to People of the Pod.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
If you could please share with our listeners about your heritage, about your upbringing. You were born in Argentina, correct?
I was born in Argentina. My father's family moved to Argentina from Morocco and Syria. My mother is from Spain. And part of what shaped my interest in Jews from the Middle East and North Africa is that when we moved to America, we moved to a Persian Jewish community. So that was like my introduction to American Jews, this very tight-knit Persian community in Long Island. Eventually, I met my husband, who's a Syrian Jew with Egyptian and Iraqi background, and I wrote my PhD on the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn. It's not just an identity, it's a tradition that I draw from and that I believe can actually give us very powerful tools right now.
Now, is this a Syrian Jewish community from Aleppo or Damascus?
Historically, there's a big difference. I would say that a lot of these communities, you can think of them as pre-immigration and then new settlement in America. Right now in America, it's one community. The differences between Aleppo and Damascus are not that pronounced. Maybe like when you cook a little bit, the recipe that you use, or slightly different songs that you might have depending where your family is from.
You are, in fact, a visiting researcher at NYU, and you are the director of the National Study of the Sephardic and Mizrahi in the United States. What is that study all about?
Yeah, so when I wanted to do a PhD at NYU, which I did, on Syrian Jews, and I wanted to study Sephardic Jews, what I realized very quickly, and you might have seen this from your other podcast, is that there is very little good scholarship, good literature to explain to us who these Jews are. This is a problem both in terms of historical research, and for me, I'm really interested in contemporary Jewish life. There was a huge gap of not having resources to understand Sephardic Jews in the United States. So I had to do my PhD kind of trying to reconstruct, even like the categories of study. How do we think about Jewish observance and religiosity with Jews from the Middle East? So this study is an early attempt. By early, I mean we hope it's the first of many studies to begin to tease out the main pillars of what we need to know to understand Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. Roughly, and again, we'll go into this more in the actual report, which will come out in a couple of months, roughly 10% of American Jews are Sephardic or Mizrahi. Very similar to, let's say, the Orthodox Jewish population, the Russian-speaking Jewish population, but much less understood, much less studied. So it's an important first attempt to begin to lay out the foundations of knowledge.
But would you say it's also important to have those Zionist spaces throughout the professional world?
Yes, very much overdue. I think it's overdue for many reasons. One of them is that in the American Jewish community, we've had for many years now conversations around diversity, around inclusion, and the like. And Sephardic Jews have not really been part of this conversation. Or let me say this with more precision, they have not been part of this conversation in terms that they would want to be part of this conversation. Maybe I'll be a little bit more explicit as to what I mean. Many of the Jews that we've studied that I know tend to reflect more socially conservative Middle Eastern forms of Jewish life. And these communities don't fit in very neatly in diversity efforts that tend to align with progressive understandings of diversity. So that means that there's been a real gap in how Sephardic Jews are included or not included in many spaces that are trying to be more inclusive. So we really believe that diversity is not easy and that it begins with listening and understanding who are the individuals and communities that we want to include.
I mean, how does kind of a deeper and broader knowledge of one's Jewish identity, one's Jewish history, how does it help? How does your deeper and broader knowledge of your identity and history help you be a better advocate? And how can it help others be better Jewish advocates?
That's a great question. So, you mentioned before that I started a weekly Jewish Wisdom Substack. It's called Committed, and I'll be grateful to share the link with everyone. The first piece that I wrote there on Genesis was actually about Jewish pride. And it was an idea that I had been thinking for a long time about. And it was that, especially since October 7th, I have been in all of these spaces with people who are newly reawakened, energized, outraged about what's been happening. And they speak constantly about the need for Jewish pride. Jewish pride, we need more Jewish pride, more Jewish pride, more Jewish pride. And on the one hand, I love that. I love that awakening. It resonates with me strongly. On the other hand, I had like this little voice whispering to me, because as a sociologist, I've actually done research that talks about pride as something, I want to try to say this carefully, as something that is sometimes the last thing a group holds on to before assimilating fully. So, in very simplistic terms, if you think about Italian Americans or Irish Americans, right, over 3 or 4 generations in this country, they will slowly lose a lot of their communal elements. They move away from their neighborhoods. They will stop only cooking Italian food. They will stop working in certain professions. But they will still have a little bit of that Irish pride in St. Patrick's Day. So I have been concerned when we speak about Jewish pride that Jewish pride can be thin and unsustainable if we don't know what we are proud of. There is a world of a difference between someone who says, there's something here that seems really good and I think I'm proud. I'm proud. And it's different than if you're standing there and you say, I am proud of a heritage spanning thousands of years. I stand in the shoulders of giants. I am continuing a legacy of Jews who have survived persecutions, who've survived assimilation, who've survived living in different countries and in different times. And I am holding all of this when I stand up as a Jew. That to me is a kind of confident pride that can help us as advocates when we are facing challenges, because we are facing challenges and we're going to continue to face challenges. So we desperately need that sense of Jewish history, that sense of spiritual sustenance. We have to know what we are proud of, what we are fighting for.
You wrote a piece shortly after October 7th, and it was titled, "The Pain You're Feeling is Peoplehood." And it was incredibly powerful. It went viral because it so perfectly captured what so many Jews were feeling at that moment. And for those who haven't read the column, can you share what led you to write it, kind of summarize it for our listeners?
I lead a community, the spiritual leader of a community called the Downtown Minyan. And like many spiritual leaders and clergy, on that Simchat Torah, I had to, I'm not saying anything new here. I was heartbroken, reeling. I don't use a phone on Shabbat. Didn't know what was happening. My family in Israel, the reports that were coming in, I felt like my soul, my heart was being ripped. I think many of us felt this. And I had a shul to run. And I had to figure out, what Jewish wisdom can I use right now? And it was very primal and instinctive. There was a teaching that I had taught before because I thought it was important, but at that moment, it felt essential. And it just came out. I stood in front of my community who were in pain, and I wanted to give them names to explain what was happening. And I used a very famous teaching by Rav Soloveitchik, who asks the question, can we still speak of ourselves as Jewish people, even with all of our diversity and differences and disagreements? And he brings up a Talmudic question about if you have a man of 2 heads, is this considered one person or two? And it's a complicated question if you take it seriously. And he offers a gruesome test to figure this out. You pour boiling water on one head, and then you look at the other. And if it cries out in pain, it is one people. If it doesn't, it is two. The reason that this teaching was important for me to say, and I think the reason you said it went viral, is because, I haven't said this like this before, so I am expressing this now, thinking with you. I think for very long, for us Jews in America, we have been pushed and compelled to think of Judaism along Protestant religious terms. What I mean by this, it's a faith. It's a set of beliefs. It's a value system. It has to fit in like some universalistic framework. And that pain that we felt on October 7th was different. It was a reminder that to be a Jew is to be part of a family, that it doesn't matter how different we are from each other, how much we disagree. When your relative is in pain, you cry with them. And it's almost like that pain to me was both a way of saying we are reminded that we're part of a family. And there's something, I don't have the right words here, there's something almost to treasure about the pain, because it reminds us that we are connected to each other, committed to each other, responsible for each other. And I think we all felt it, and it took away some of the layers of conditioning that many of us have had to pretend like we aren't a family. That's what I think was one of the things that were so powerful about the tragedy that we all experienced.
Yeah, because we're so trained to be individuals, right? Especially here in America, right? That individual spirit. That's not part of peoplehood. Or is it? I don't know. Maybe that's not the point.
Yeah, listen, I think our tradition is amazing and complex, and there's strands of it that brings up individualism and agency. But there's powerful strands that talk about us as a family, as a collective, as a tribe. And there's powerful elements in our culture that have been pushing against that. And in many parts of our community, I think we drank the Kool-Aid. And we said, that's backwards. That's not who we are anymore. And then we were reminded that there's something there that we all felt was true. It existed before October 7th. But I think October 7th kind of like woke it up. When I've shared this metaphor of the two-headed man with people, many of them have offered an objection, and they've said, how awful is it for us to speak about who we are based on anti-Semitism? It shouldn't have to be like that. But, I would agree with that critique on theoretical terms. On sociological, human terms, there is nothing that is more potent than having a shared enemy, a shared tragedy. Think about a family again, how tragedy brings us together. So I think that unfortunately, the fact that there is still anti-Semitism vibrant in our societies and our streets has served to continue to reinforce that initial sense that we had after October 7th. Of course, there are rifts. We can talk about debates that are happening. We are not as united as right after the tragedy. But, I wrote a piece for CNN basically saying that the virulent anti-Semitism in the anti-Zionist movement is creating more Zionists. It's creating more Jewish solidarity. And it hasn't gone away. I am a religious woman. When I pray to God, I ask God that God should give us the challenge of having to remain connected in good times. I prefer that. But being that we don't have that right now, I do think that we have to double down on what our response is.
You wrote another piece for CNN that had to do with the anti-Israel protests on university campuses and the fear that it was inducing in so many Jewish young people, and the solidarity that was coming out of that. So with that in mind, one thing that the Jewish communal world is experiencing, we're certainly seeing it here at AJC, is an influx in involvement. Not just solidarity, but activism and advocacy, people who want to be more involved. Have you given any thought to this influx and whether or not the infrastructure is in place, here in America especially, to kind of sustain that level of involvement and activism?
So one of the things that I've seen, and I'll be honest that I'm still trying to understand it, but one of the things that I'm seeing is there's a thing called the organized Jewish community, and it's a powerful ecosystem, with levers of power and influence. And I'm also privy, partially because of my work with young Jews, to a whole world of people who are wanting to be active, but who either don't have the access or the orientation to do so within the organized Jewish community. And for me, part of what's still missing are like the bridges between these different ecosystems. There's all of these people who are active on social media, right? The world of influencers. There's this groups of young Jews who are creating pop-up Shabbat dinners, like all over the place, and like creating like new clubs to celebrate Shabbat with each other and Jewish identity. And there's a lot of energy there. And what I'm trying to figure out is I'm thinking of this as almost like two powerful ecosystems. And I think that they would both be more powerful if they're in better conversation with each other. So that to me, again, it's a little bit abstract. I'm still thinking it through. I am a scholar in residence at the Maimonides Fund. And this is one of the questions that I have right now in this post-October 7th world. What would it mean to better bridge between these different ecosystems?
We just talked about the campus protests and the solidarity that they fuel. We've also talked about the lack of research and scholarship out there about Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, the diversity of the Jewish community. Do you think if young people had a better grasp of the thousands of years of history, of Jewish history in the Middle East, do you think that would shift the conversation at all, that education? And I don't mean just within, obviously, the Jewish community. I mean more broadly.
Yeah, so I would say two things. I take to heart what my friend Haviv Ratigur, who's a brilliant analyst, he speaks a lot about the fact that Jews, we don't know our own story. And I do think there is like huge lack of literacy in understanding that there were nearly 1 million Jews all across the Middle East and North Africa, and they left, fled, or were expelled in like massive Arab nationalist, anti-Zionist regimes that were propped up across the region. So I do think that for people to know these stories would be incredibly powerful. I do want to note something, though, as someone who's been active in academia, I still have one foot there. I think that in many places, and we need to not be naive, in many places, people have vested interest in certain narratives. And they are emotionally attached to this narrative, and they have no incentive to change them, no matter how many counterfactuals you provide to them. So there is definitely many parts in academia that want to think of the world as divided between the oppressors and the oppressed, and who want to think of Jews and Israel and Zionists as aligned with the oppressors who they equate to Europeans and white and Westerners. And no matter how many counterfactuals you will give to them, they will find a way, again, and I'm happy to explain those, they will find ways to make it fit into their narrative. So we need a multi-pronged approach. One approach is to give the literacy to those who are seeking it as a way to have greater strength and intellectual tools at their disposal. Also, there's like a huge middle to convince, that can be moved. And when it comes to those ideologues, we have to battle their narratives.
In other words, offering that literacy to the Jewish community first, to those who actually want it, who are curious enough to want it. That's step one.
Yeah, Jewish community, friends of the Jewish community, people who are intellectually honest and want to have a better discourse around Israel, the Middle East, and current reality.
So, Mijal, I'm curious how your conversations have changed and evolved since October 7th. I initially wanted to ask you about interfaith dialogue. Well, maybe intercultural dialogue is a better way to put it. But did you have more intercultural dialogue before October 7th or after October 7th? Or is your work really immersed in the Jewish community and Jewish dialogue?
Yeah. So I would say like this. I think before October 7th, I had spent many years focused on interfaith work. I think that the interfaith work was often anchored in more liberal and progressive spaces. And many of those efforts really imploded. And I think that I represent, because I've heard this from so many people who basically said we've invested years into showing up for others and into relationships. And then if I can get someone to say that, like, you don't need to like Israel, you don't need to like Netanyahu, but just that Hamas raping and murdering is wrong and evil, then what am I doing here? So I think that definitely I have been affected by that, by seeing that. And right now I think we're in a place a year out when there is new energy in trying to figure out, okay, who are those people that we can still talk to? And they exist. And also I think that, and this is like work that is ongoing, there's a real sense that we need to re-examine the work that we were doing. Perhaps we were investing in the wrong interfaith relationships and spaces, which doesn't mean interfaith work is bad, but maybe we need to invest in other parts of interfaith work.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
I mean, yeah, this is like personal. I am not going to be spending time in interfaith work with people who give Hamas a pass. I'll just say this. And I think there's a lot, for me, I am much more interested right now in pursuing relationships with socially conservative leaders of other faiths that perhaps in the past we wouldn't have been in the same tables around interfaith work, and who have spoken up with clarity when it comes to defending Jews and speaking up against anti-Semitism. This doesn't mean, again, I don't want to imply that we should walk away from spaces. You said before, it's important to have people fighting in many different areas. I think the real question we have to ask ourselves is, what are the lines that if they are crossed, we walk away? Because I think too many Jews for too long have stayed in spaces where our basic story, dignity and humanity was trampled, and we accepted that price. And that is not something we can do anymore. So we have to figure out, how do we reconfigure relationships? How do we stand up for ourselves in different ways? How do we, and I'll say this, in many places, like, Jews showed up and agreed to, pound their chest about their white Jewish privilege as a price of entry into coalitions and relationships in ways that just were not honest. We need to fight all of this.
You recently hosted AJC CEO Ted Deutsch on your podcast, Wondering Jews, and I'm curious what you learned from your exchange with him, both on and off the air.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I co-host the podcast Wandering Jews with Noam Weissman. It was really nice. I mentioned this on that episode, but I have a very fond personal memory of my first encounter with Ted. It was at the March in Washington, and I was one of their earliest featured speakers at the March, 300,000 people in person, many watching live. And I was very nervous, and I was pacing behind backstage. And I see Ted, and I'd never met him before, but I had read about him. And when I read about him, I was I was curious. I'm like, who lives a seat in Congress to go and work for the Jews? So I was already fascinated by who would make this career switch. And then I saw him, and I don't know why, I turned to him and I asked him if I could practice with him. And he literally had me practice my speech. I memorized it, and I practiced, and he gave me some feedback, and I changed some of the words. And his wife lent me her hostage tag necklace because I wanted to have one on stage, and it was early days, I didn't have one. So my first encounter with him it felt like a very personal one. And that's what came across, I think, in the podcast, that Ted is this member of Congress, runs AJC, but he's so warm, and it is so obvious in everything that he says that this is not a job for him, but it is a passion and a life's mission. And the way that he spoke about just his love for the Jewish people, for spirituality, for what it means to stand up in the world, is hope and optimism. He speaks about relationships that you can insist and make sure that you can have right now. It's very moving to find leaders who are running institutions and who themselves are able to embody a very powerful sense of conviction. We need more leaders like that.
So tell us about your newest project.
Yeah, it's called Committed. That's the name of the Substack. I started it on Simchat Torah. I'm still tinkering with it, how long it should be, the tone, this, that. I'm very lucky to have a lot of readers and students who eagerly give me feedback as to what works and what doesn't, which is lovely because I love learning Torah with them. But really, as many conversations that I've had with people about anti-Semitism and advocacy and Zionism on campus, as many conversations that I've been having around anti-Semitism and Israel and politics, I have been having the same number of conversations about Judaism and spirituality and the soul and what it means to be part of this magnificent tradition. I have been taken aback that often in my classes and lectures, it will end with people coming to me afterwards and wanting to speak about their Jewish journeys, what it means to raise Jewish children, what it means to learn Torah if you didn't grow up learning Torah and now you want to, what it means to know that we are souls with bodies as opposed to bodies with souls. All of these things, I have felt that it's really important to try to have weekly touch points that we can have to ask big questions and to be able to address them using Jewish tradition. So in my Substack so far, I've explored, like I mentioned before, Jewish pride, what it means to have Jewish pride. I've explored what it means to have, using the stories of Abraham and Rebecca, what it means to, when the world is burning, to know that we have multiple modes of responses. One of them is to provide justice, put out the flame. Another mode is to help those who have burn marks and to just show care to them and be with them in times of need. The one that I wrote that I think went the farthest, one was around sacrifice, the binding of Isaac, which I wrote about what it means to, from America, look at Israeli parents and know that they are raising children who are willing to sacrifice in a way that American children are just not being taught. I use the story of Jacob and Esau, and I did a bit of a thought experiment. What would have happened if a Chabad emissary would have met the bad twin of Jacob? And there's all of these texts that actually allow us to imagine that Esau could have become a leader of the Jewish people if he would have been shown the kind of love that Chabad emissaries give. So I think there's amazing ways to approach Jewish tradition and to use Jewish tradition as a way to ask the most critical questions about what it means to live as a Jew today.
I imagine you'll be lighting candles soon for Hanukkah. Any other special family traditions?
The one thing I would say that I love that we do in our Sephardic communities, we light a little bit differently. And this is a traditional way. There's some Sephardic Jews that have changed this a little bit. But traditionally, we light one Hanukkah as a family. So in many Ashkenazi communities, each individual lights their own. Classically, in the Sephardic tradition, a family has one Hanukkah. We try to light it either by a window or even better outside. So my family, my parents, my siblings, they have a special Hanukkah with like a glass panels, and we always light it outside the house, facing the streets in a very real way. And I think that's an important symbol for us, what it means to insist on our lights in public spaces, what it means to fight for public spaces, and what it means, I would say, Hanukkah has become such a commercialized holiday in America that lives alongside Christmas and that feels good. And it's become not just a watered down version of its original premise, but in many ways the opposite. Because what the Maccabees did is they took on not just the Greek Empire in military terms, they took on the Greek Empire in cultural and spiritual terms. And they resisted assimilation with everything they had. So in a funny way, in America, to fit in, we've remade Hanukkah in terms that have been opposite than its original meaning. And I think this last year asked us to reconsider what Hanukkah should look like. And what would it mean? We shouldn't, I'm not saying we should be like the Maccabees exactly. They're complicated story as well. But what would it mean to make sure that we're not only lighting a light outside, but that we are expressing our Judaism in Jewish terms, even when it's a little bit uncomfortable for others.
Mijal, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Really great to be here.
If you've missed our most recent episodes, be sure to tune in for my conversation with Bishop Joseph Bambera about a groundbreaking Catholic Jewish initiative, Translate Hate, the Catholic edition. At a time when recent events have challenged Catholic-Jewish relations, the chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs shared why the Church has made combating anti-Semitism a priority. And don't miss the conversation with AJC CEO Ted Deutsch and renowned French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy about what lessons can be drawn from the post-October 7th era. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #peopleofthepod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.